Hello and good morning. My name is Sister Eleanor Marie Pateo, and I'm a Dominican sister of St. Cecilia Congregation, and I currently work at Aquinas College in Nashville, Tennessee. Prior to entering the Dominican Sisters of St. Cecilia in 2011, I studied undergraduate and graduate and postgraduate studies in psychology. I worked on research projects specifically examining the effects of diet and sleep on cognitive, language, social and emotional development, as well as the impacts on mental health. Since entering the Dominican Sisters of St. Cecilia, I have continued my studies in education and taught in high schools in the United States. For 3 years, I taught classes in psychology and research methods in higher education institutes in Australia. I am currently teaching educational psychology courses at Aquinas College, and it is a privilege to be able to share with you some of my research and thoughts about this topic, cultivating hope and trust, overcoming obstacles to depressive and anxiety symptoms in the classroom. As you can imagine, especially today, these are the kinds of things that we are most concerned about as Catholic educators. I would like to begin our presentation today with a case study. Have you ever had a student who was anxious, who asked a lot of questions, who was aggressive, or just did not seem to care? I would like to begin this presentation with Julia. As I read this case study, see if there are symptoms or signs that you also may have encountered within the classroom. When Julia was in elementary school, she was excited about school and loved to learn. She really wanted to do a good job. But she had dyslexia and early on realized that she was not like all the other students. She was slow at reading, especially when she was in 3rd grade. She knew she was not great at spelling. Her friends always seemed to zoom past her, flipping pages over and over again, while she herself struggling on the same page. When Julia went to high school, she began to experience still other struggles. She found it difficult to make friends. She hated gym class and could not seem to complete her homework on time. She started feeling tired, sad, and irritable. Around sophomore year, she would begin to skip school. She wanted to sleep, didn't care about anything, and did not want to go to school. She felt quite anxious. Her mum would drive her to school, but she just couldn't seem to make herself get out of the car. Sometimes it would take to the count of 10 or 11, and often she would end up in tears. When she did manage to go to school, she did not seem to get the help she needed. Some teachers would not meet with her, but Julia felt they didn't really want to. They didn't seem to have much time for her. She didn't like to be there, and since she didn't seem to get the help she needed and did not understand what she was being taught in class, she would just give up. She would talk to the students near her. She would be rude and give one-line answers and engage in any activity other than what was being asked of her. Julia seems to have a problem. Dyslexia, yes, but also there might be a sense of loneliness, a sense that she's not good enough. Perhaps she feels others will make fun of her at school. It could also be that there are other factors. Is she living at home with both parents? Is there a conflict in the house? Is her mum or dad working such late hours that she is alone at home for a lot of the day? Or does she live with her mum most of the week and her dad on weekends, making homework on the weekends difficult to complete? It is not at all uncommon for us as teachers to encounter students like Julia, who engage in off-task behavior, do not turn in their homework on time, ask repetitive questions, become irritable and aggressive. As teachers, we care about our students, but when they are difficult and manifest these kinds of behaviors, it can be challenging to communicate that concern. Consequently, these children may perceive that their teachers do not care about them, and this perception may actually reinforce their behavior. As Catholic educators, concerned with the whole well-being of our students, we need to ask what fears all of these classroom behaviors are masking. Often these behaviors are manifestations of deeper issues with anxiety and depression. And beneath those issues lies the fear of complete isolation, the fear of not being loved. Deep down in the hearts of these children is a need to be supported and loved. Creating a classroom environment in which each student experiences loving concern and has the opportunity to build trusting relationships can be a positive step toward growth in security and hope. Such a classroom can be a healing atmosphere for students who struggle with anxiety and depressive symptoms. The main objectives of this presentation today is to describe and identify the key signs and symptoms of 3 pertinent anxiety disorders, to describe and identify the key signs and symptoms of depressive disorders, and finally, to provide practical strategies to assist you in confronting these issues in the classroom in a way that cultivates both trust and hope. So in beginning this topic, I would like us to ask ourselves, what is anxiety? Is anxiety normal? As you can imagine, a low level of anxiety is good. We need a little bit of anxiety. This is what helps us to get out of bed in the morning. It encourages us to study for the test, or it may prompt us to fold the laundry so that the pile doesn't get too high. In a few moments, we will discuss the 3 signs that indicate when anxiety is not normal. But first, I would like us to distinguish between anxiety and fear. When a person experiences fear, one often hears them say that they feel afraid. They are alluding to the fact that something in the body changes. There is a physiological change in response to the object that the person perceives as an evil or a threat. So fear occurs when one shrinks from an immediate evil, which is both overwhelming and inescapable. It's going to happen. So let's think of an example. How would you feel if you were walking in the park and there is a mountain lion in front of you? You would probably feel afraid. Your heart rate would probably increase. You would experience a shortness of breath. Your eyes would get large. And in this experience, you have fear. This is the impending mountain lion on your path is unavoidable. As I said, anxiety is a kind of fear, and it deals with an unforeseen evil, or an uncertainty about evils that you don't understand, or about whose consequences you have no knowledge. There is a resulting lack of cognitive clarity. You simply aren't thinking right. So for example, imagine you have been invited to a friend's special birthday. You don't know any of her family or friends who have also been invited there. Will they like you? Will they be friendly to you? Will you look like a fool? Will they think you are strange? And at the moment, with the current COVID virus, you might be thinking, where have they been? Do they have a virus? Could they give you the virus? And so the list goes on and on and on, and it brings a fog into your mind. It preoccupies your thoughts, and it makes it difficult for you to concentrate. So now, why don't we have a think about the different types of anxiety disorders? In the 2013 edition of the Manual for Diagnostic Disorders, it made significant changes to the classification of anxiety disorders. So as you can see here on this slide, the manual classified 6 anxiety disorders. However, because of time for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the 3 most pertinent anxiety disorders for teaching. These are separation anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder. So let's begin with separation anxiety disorder. This is prevalent in younger children. There is some level of anxiety separation is normal and developmentally appropriate. However, over time, if children do not adjust to separation, This anxiety can make going to school difficult or even impossible. You might see children in the classroom who are over clingy with their parent, and the anticipation of separation from a parent might result in tantrums or excess distress. These students often feel compelled to use their phones throughout the day because they want to check in with their parents. So you might also experience that they frequently visit the nurse's office with complaints of stomach pains and headaches so that they can get into contact with one of their parents. It can also manifest in school refusal. Social anxiety disorder. This is particularly common in adolescents, and it is a pervasive fear of embarrassment, especially in a situation in which one must interact with or perform in front of other people. This fear in turn increases the feeling of worry or anxiety. So what does it look like in the classroom? Well, students might avoid giving presentations in person, or going to a gym class, or eating in the cafeteria, or doing group work. And we might even see it manifested in the virtual learning setting. So perhaps students might avoid attending virtual meetings. Perhaps they feel self-conscious when they see themselves on a video call. When the student begins to skip events, it may seem that he or she is uninterested in the event, but they could just simply be afraid of making a mistake, or that others will judge him or her. The student may also be afraid that others would stare or laugh or ridicule. And then finally, we have generalized anxiety disorder. This is where the child has this excessive worry and anxiety, which is difficult for them to control because the child is continuously preoccupied by this anxiety. It becomes all-consuming. The excessive worry is not specific, and it might be about future events. It could be about past behaviors. It could be about family matters, personal abilities, school performance. For a child who has GAD, there's just no on or off switch for the worry. There are 4 signs of GAD, and these include inattention, aggressive behaviors, repetitive questions, and perfectionism. Often, inattention in the classroom is presumed to be a symptom of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But anxiety could also be the cause. Children who are anxious may find it difficult to focus on the lesson or to ignore their worried thoughts that are consuming their attention. Feeling out of control, you might see them act out. Perhaps they compulsively engage in aggressive behavior. In an online forum, this might include disruption to online discussions. Children with anxiety usually ask repetitive questions, a habit brought on by their feelings of anxiety. Again, in the virtual learning setting, students might repeatedly email teachers questions. Finally, anxious children might become overly perfectionistic, wanting to know in detail why they received a particular grade. The desire to improve might become so consuming that it occupies all their thoughts. This tendency is not only associated with children who receive the straight A's, but also if they display a sudden drop in grades. The students may have done the homework because they began, but then all of a sudden they begin to second guess themselves. So when does anxiety become a problem? I would say there are 3 signs that indicate anxiety is becoming a problem and may not be normal. The first is avoidance. This is where you might see a student who begins to avoid activities or events. They may avoid certain parts of the house, or maybe they become all particular situations. They may consistently neglect their homework or avoid that which makes them uncomfortable. Secondly, interference. So the anxiety begins to interfere with their normal functioning. In particular, a parent may find that a large proportion of the day seems consumed with trying to get the child to go to school or to go to bed, for example. And thirdly, there's a distress. So these children might seem fine when they're at school because they're just simply trying to get through the day. But then when they get home, their defenses are shattered and their distress manifests itself in bursts of emotion. It's also important to consider whether the behavior you're observing is persistent for a long period of time or whether it is transient. That is, does it persist for most of the day or for many days of the week, or the month, or for the first couple of months of school? So now that we've considered anxiety disorders, I'd like us to move on to look at mood disorders. So in the Manual for Diagnostic Disorders, mood disorder is described as being either unipolar, so this is one mood is experienced, typically depression, or bipolar, so two moods are experienced, both depression and mania. While there are several types of depressive disorders, these disorders all have common symptoms. So today we're just going to focus on the general symptoms of depressive disorders or depression, which you can see here on this slide. As you can imagine, most children will normally feel sad or irritable occasionally, and this might be due to a difficult circumstance at a particular time. The depressed mood is indicative of a normal but transitory response to a specific event. However, if this irritability lasts for a long time, a more problematic situation can develop. Symptoms of depression include recurrent temper outbursts, depressed or irritable mood, problems with eating, sleep, low energy, or being very fidgety in the classroom. It could also be associated with low self-esteem. Perhaps they have difficulty concentrating, feelings of hopelessness, inappropriate guilt, or recurrent suicidal ideation. What are some warning signs that you might see in the classroom that could indicate that a child might be suffering from depressive symptoms? Well, first of all, you might recognize a decline in academic performance. Perhaps they exhibit a change in the mood. Or perhaps descriptions of children and adolescents who are viewed as depressed suggest that they may manifest a change in irritable mood. This change in irritability has to be manifested for most of the day and for more days than not. The child or adolescent may also exhibit a change in the relationship with their family members. There could be increase in frequent absences from school because the child is just too tired to go to school. And finally, the child often does not want to do things that he or she usually would want to do. For example, perhaps they begin to withdraw from activities and friends. What might be some warning signs that you see within the virtual classroom? This could also include a sudden change in student performance, perhaps disruption to or lack of presence in online discussions. You might see a failure to respond to emails, content of work becoming negative or dark in tone, and disrespect in discussion posts. Okay, so now I'd like us to think about what are some practical ways in which we can help these students. And I think a really great starting place is this passage that you see here on your screen from Pope Benedict XVI. Here, he offers perhaps unexpected insights into the anxiety and depressive behaviors, which as teachers we often witness in our classrooms. His insights here can shape the practical measures in which we take in responding to the needs of students in our care. So he says, the worst anxiety of all is the fear of not being loved, the loss of love. Despair is thus the conviction that one has forfeited all love forever. The horror of complete isolation. Hope, in the proper sense of the word, is thus the reverse, the certainty that I shall receive that great love that is indestructible, and that I am already loved with this love here and now. So Benedict XVI demonstrates that at the heart of the anxiety and depression issues, so frequently encountered within the classroom is the fear of not being loved. Today, many students feel that being loved is dependent upon the level of perfection, perhaps, or success achieved at school. One of the greatest remedies for anxiety and depression is for the student to know from experience that he is loved for who he or she is. It is often through the teacher that the student can experience this assurance, opening him to a deeper awareness of God's love. The secret to helping students who are suffering from anxiety and depression issues lies precisely in cultivating the child's capacity to be open to God's presence. So, you might be asking yourselves, how can we as Catholic educators do this? I would suggest that the first way we do this is by building a community of trust. So we may want to provide, and it's important for us to provide the needed academic instruction to our students. But it is equally important that we do so in ways that build supportive relationships with and among them. So first of all, we need to address our own anxieties. Our first step for us as teachers is to recognize our own anxieties or fears, and then how these emotions may be related to our thinking and behavior. Our responses and reactions to students might be affected by our conscious and unconscious fears and anxieties. In an effort to confront this tendency, I would say that we can place ourselves in the Lord's presence and ask these three questions. What are my own anxieties or fears or other emotions? How are these related to my underlying thoughts? How does this affect my behavior in the classroom? And my responses to my students. So I think this is best illustrated with an example, which I'm going to give you now. And this is a little scenario. So imagine that we are ill-prepared for a class because of certain circumstances in the home. You have some thoughts. I am going to blank in class. The students won't pay attention. I'll lose my respect with them. And this might be related to emotions such as fear, anxiety, sadness, that butterfly feeling in the stomach that sometimes we get, which leads to nausea. And then anxious ourselves, we may brush aside an anxious student who approaches us for help. This response can inadvertently increase the student's anxiety and depression. We may offhandedly tell the student to not worry about it and you won't fail. This dismissive advice that does not help their disturbed state of mind. The student, having been brushed off, concludes that the teacher is not nice and doesn't care. And so the student simply begins to avoid the teacher. Before we enter the classroom, we must be aware of the triggers that cause us anxiety. This will be important in helping us to live in the present moment and to be available and present to the student who is in front of us. If a student recognizes that the teacher is open and willing and available to listen, then he or she will feel confident in approaching the teacher for help. Our disposition of openness and receptivity in appearing present to our students is an important step in building relationships with our students in the classroom. Doing so, of course, does not mean that we are becoming friends with them. It is rather a matter of asking ourselves how we might become instruments of grace in our students' lives and help them to feel less vulnerable. I also have here some other practical suggestions, including daily check-ins, getting to know you, finding ways to get to know each student personally, finding ways to get to know and work with each student's families, helping your students to see that you care about them. Providing examples from your own life too can give them an opportunity to get to know you. Journaling or reflective activities, and I have a couple of examples on the next slide which might be helpful for you. And I think finally, one of the really important things that we need to do is to depersonalize the student's behavior by seeing if the behavior is a result of difficulties with emotional regulation. So for example, is the student acting out because he is struggling with academic work that might cause him to feel vulnerable? What is causing this child to feel unsafe that he needs to show this aggression in my classroom? So here we have just a couple of examples of journaling activities which you could carry out in your own classroom. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is to examine our response with students. Seeking to understand how our response to students may in turn serve to build up or tear them down is also a factor in creating a classroom atmosphere in which hope can flourish. So children who are preoccupied with anxiety are constantly asking themselves, what if? And they're imagining many different scenarios that may not happen. Consequently, they often tend to ask lots of questions. And we can have a tendency to reply with some impatience. For example, why are you worried? Or why are you stressed? Or you'll be okay. Since the student is already experiencing the physiological symptoms that we discussed earlier associated with anxiety, these responses are just not helpful. A better approach is to affirm or validate what the student is experiencing. Help them to label it and then help them in taking the next steps. So here are some examples. It sounds like you are worried about, or it sounds like you are stressed and have a lot to do, or there is a lot to do, but how about trying this? And then providing them with clear suggestions or strategies that could help them to refocus their energies in a positive way. Okay, so finally, I'd like to think about building a community of hope. If it's true that anxiety is bound up in fear of losing love and in the consequent isolation that follows from this, healing grace lies in cultivating the virtue of hope. One of the freedoms which we do enjoy as Catholic educators is that of fashioning classrooms that foster hope in this boundless love of God and his eternal desires for us. With this hope, as a given in our classroom, we have this ready setting in which to form our students in redirecting negative thought patterns that can occur with anxiety and depressive symptoms. Negative thought patterns may contribute to feelings of despair. Conversations with peers may in turn also exacerbate hopelessness. So giving students tools to help them become aware of such distortions can enable them and to help them to learn how to refocus their minds. I'd like to just talk about 3 ways in which sometimes children engage in what we call cognitive distortions. There are many though. So the first here that I want to discuss today is all or none thinking. You might have experienced this yourself as well. This is when we view things in only 2 categories. For example, things are either good or bad. Or thinking that one must either perform well on everything or else the student is a failure. So a child does not do well on one spelling test and so they conclude, I'm a failure. The second one is overgeneralization. And this is taking one negative detail from a situation and then making it a universal pattern about his whole life. So for example, a child doesn't get an A on a test and so they conclude he can't do anything right. And then finally, we have fortune telling. This is predicting that events will turn out in a negative way. So for example, Sonia thinks that if she tries to talk to Eric, he'll never accept her. So she never talks to him. In helping children overcome cognitive distortions, it's helpful to begin by identifying an observable problem behavior. So I suggest that you might like to use a chart like this with your students. So for example, let's say you notice that a student is consistently staring out of the window during math class. Having first spoken to the child about it, the teacher might help them to identify what is the observable problem behavior that I need to work on. So if I'm staring out the window, am I paying attention to the math lesson? What makes me do this? And then the teacher might get them to think about their emotions. What am I feeling when I'm staring out the window? Am I anxious? I start to feel sick. I can't breathe. Why? Well, I'm anxious about all the math problems I have to complete. I also really don't know where to start. It's overwhelming. Then the teacher might get the student to think about, well, what are the thoughts or statements that come to mind? Perhaps they think, I'm hopeless, or I can't do this, or I'm going to fail. And then the teacher can help the student to come up with ways to talk reason to himself. So it could be trying to get started instead of giving up, or what's the first thing I should do? How am I doing on this task? This is hard, but I can do it. I know I can do this. I just have to slow down and take my time. Calm down, take a deep breath. Or do I need to ask for help? So one of the last things I like to talk about is providing times of silence. When children experience anxiety and depression, they are not only preoccupied with their negative thoughts, but they also have this aroused nervous system. So these students tend to be very tense for most of the day. Research has shown that providing children with times of silence to slow down, pay attention to their thoughts and emotions can be really helpful. So as Catholic educators, a guided prayer time that's focused can be very helpful for our students because it allows them to refocus their mind and their attention to the Lord and away from their worried thoughts. So this is just an example of a little guided prayer that you could do at the beginning of a class. So perhaps you get the students to sit quietly to recall the presence of God. Perhaps they can be grateful for all the Lord has done in their lives. Perhaps invoking the Holy Spirit to help. And then finally getting them to recognize the moments that they felt anxious or sad or hopeful. So in conclusion, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI asserts in his encyclical, the one who has hope lives differently. What is at the heart of this difference? Christian hope draws us to realize that even when we feel we can no longer talk to or call upon anyone else, we can always talk to God. When there is no longer anyone to help us deal with a need or expectation that goes beyond the human capacity for hope, God is always there to help. So Benedict XVI reminds us that we are on a journey, and this journey is often dark and stormy, and so we need lights to help direct the way. As Catholic educators, we too are called to be lights who can help direct children to their heavenly homeland and to remind them that they are loved infinitely by God. So thank you for listening today. I'd like to just make you aware of Aquinas College that I spoke to you at the beginning, which is where I currently teach. We have, if you are interested in a topic like this or in other educational topics, I'd invite you to visit our website because we frequently give webinars and courses and formation workshops for Catholic educators. I also have some resources and references that might be helpful for you as well. Thank you, take care, and God bless you.